We are videoing out to the world from Portland, Oregon, the south waterfront overlooking the Willamette River, which is the world headquarters of Converging Paths, and also quite close to First Congregational United Church of Christ in downtown that is bringing you the Converging Paths podcast. I am super excited about our guest this evening. She's a friend actually of our first guest ever on the Converging Paths video cast, Gareth Higgins. You may remember him. This is Deneen Akers, and Deneen has written a book called Holy Troublemakers and Unconventional Saints, which is worth its own conversation. But what put her on the map for me, and maybe we'll talk about this book a little later too, is her writing on the divine feminine and God as mother. I think you'll find the conversation very interesting as we explore this. It's part of our master series, Life Beyond the Pandemic, where we're really looking to what have we learned during this pandemic time that we might want to bring forward. And well, we're taking some cues from an ancient mystic named Julian of Norwich, who wrote profoundly during a pandemic about the motherhood of God. But before we get to Deneen, let's hear a little bit of, this is a tune you may recognize by Bob Dylan called Gonna Serve Somebody, but it's actually written by, somebody, let's just see if you can guess. Let's go to his version of Gotta Serve Somebody.
Might be an ambassador to England or France. You might like to gamble, you might like to dance. You might be the heavyweight champion of the world. Could be a socialite with a long string of pearls, but you gotta serve somebody. Serve somebody. Yeah, you gotta serve somebody. Serve somebody. Be the devil, it might be the Lord, but you gotta serve somebody. You might be a rock and roller prancing on the stage. Might have money and drugs, women in a cage. You may be a business man or some Wall Street thief. They may call you doctor, or they may call you cheap, but you gotta serve somebody. Serve somebody. Yeah, you gotta serve somebody. Serve somebody. It might be the devil, it might be the Lord, but you gotta serve somebody. You could be a stage trooper, you might be a young Turk, you might be the head of some big TV network. You may be rich or poor, you may be blind or lame. You could be living in another country under an assumed name, but you gotta serve somebody. Serve somebody. Yeah, you gotta serve somebody. Serve somebody. It might be the devil, it might be the Lord, but you gotta serve somebody. You might be a construction worker, working on a home, maybe living in a mansion, maybe living in a dome. You may even own guns, you may even own tanks. Might be somebody landlord, may even own a bank, but you gotta serve somebody. Serve somebody. Serve somebody. Serve somebody. It might be the devil, it might be the Lord, but you gotta serve somebody. You may be a preacher with your own spiritual pride. You may be a city councilman taking bribes on the side. You may be working in a barbershop. You maybe even know how to cut hair. Maybe somebody's mistress, maybe somebody's au pair, but you gotta serve somebody. Serve somebody. Yeah, you gotta serve somebody. Serve somebody. It might be the devil, it might be the Lord, but you gotta serve somebody. Might like to wear cotton, might might like to wear silk, might like to drink whiskey, might even like milk, may even like caviar. Soak it up with your bread. Baby sleeping on the floor or sleeping in a king-size bed. But you gotta serve somebody. Serve somebody. You gotta serve somebody. Yeah. Serve somebody. It might be the devil, it might be the Lord, but you gotta serve somebody. Yeah, you gotta serve somebody. You gotta lay your body and your soul down, way down to the ground. But you gotta be in the service of somebody. You gotta serve somebody. You gotta serve somebody. Yeah. Well, it might be the devil, it might be the Lord, but you gotta serve somebody.
All right, you guys, did you catch who that is out in the podcast world, Bot Vidcast? I forgot that his name comes up on the screen immediately. It was Eric Burton, and but do you know what bands he's played in? He was originally from The Animals, and then later was part of this little funk band called War. So, good guy. Well, before getting to Deneen, I want to mention that next week we'll be returning to Portland for a guest. Deneen's coming from North Carolina, and right, North Carolina. Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Ian Durius, he is a stand-up comic here in Portland, and he'll be coming to us talking about dualism. And I really feel like I should have something really funny, a joke that makes, that's a kind of a non-dualistic joke that I could give. But if he's watching this podcast, then he'd probably rate my joke, so I'm not going to make any joke at all. That's Ian Durius. So let's bring on Deneen here. Deneen, it's good to have you with us on the videocast.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
And you've been, before we begin, you do have this book that really first put me on your radar, Holy Troublemakers, Unconventional Saints. Can you just give us just a real brief synopsis of what that book is about?
Sure. It's a children's book. It's meant for middle grades and up, and it's an anthology of original portraits and profiles of people of diverse faiths who have worked for love and justice in their corner of the world. So I actually have it open right now to Reverend Will Gaffney.
Nice.
So the art is amazing. Wow. I did not do all of the art. I just worked with a lot of artists, and it's just meant to help introduce children to the type of people of faith that I want my children to know about, people who work for the common good of us all, and especially an emphasis on people whom faith narratives have often left out, especially women, people of color, LGBTQ people, disabled people, indigenous people, people who have not often made our religious texts. So it's been a really soul-saving project for me. I started it right after the 2016 election, and it's been really great seeing the world through the lens of these kind of people.
Yeah. Well, I've got my copy right here, so I'm enjoying it myself. That's a well done book. Congratulations on that. And it was really out of concern for your, you have two children.
Yes.
And that really kind of got you really thinking even more deeply about how we use language within the Christian perennial tradition, right?
Yes. I have two children, both daughters. One is currently 5 and one just turned 12. So I've kind of got the range going on there.
Yeah.
And I definitely, these are like the language we use for God is something that I had been attuned to before, but it was really while I was pregnant with my first daughter that I just had a visceral experience. One time I was actually at church, a little church in San Francisco, and it was the first time I had heard a song use a feminine pronoun for the divine. I'd intellectually heard people talk about, all inclusiveness of the divine and things like that. But generally, I had grown up in a tradition where mankind was meant to represent all of us, God was always he. All imagery, all metaphors, all stories were always male centric. Even though certainly lip service was paid to the idea that all are created in the image of God, I realized that had not landed on me until I heard this song. I don't even know if you're familiar. It's one of those old worship songs. I have a maker. I have a maker. Da 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 da. And the words go, she formed my heart. I'd heard that many, many times, but with a he. So I have a maker. She formed my heart. Even before time began, my life was in her hands. She knows my name. She knows my every thought. She sees each tear that falls and hears me when I call. And that was it. The other verses, heed, as typical. It was just that one verse, and I was sobbing in my seat, just weeping. And it hit me on a heart level that I had never felt as somebody who is in a feminine form. I had never felt that the divine image included me. And that was something that I really started to notice. And then later, as my daughter got older, I started to pray with her to God as mother occasionally, in the secrecy of our own home at first. And gradually she started pushing me to be a little more integrated about that. She asked me at one point, why do you never pray to God in front of our family members the way you pray to God in front of me, and things like that? And now she's the big sister, and her 5-year-old little sister, she's been teaching her to pray to Mother God since she was about 3. And now my little one on her own has changed that to Mama God. And it is the sweetest thing. She just has these expansive, dear Mama God, thank you for the world and all living things, and for trees and flowers and rainbows, and then whatever specific thing she happens to be thinking about at that moment. The soft fur of my dog, or that we're eating mac and cheese tonight, or, And it's just been really beautiful to see it become a natural part of who she is. And she doesn't read yet. And especially in the last pandemic year, with us being so isolated, she doesn't have any concept that is an unusual thing. I grieve a little bit for her when she starts to realize that it is not a typical thing to hear everybody speak about God in feminine form. To her, every time she hears a story about God, she's always like, oh, and she created this and she did that. And it's beautiful. And I also know it's so fragile and won't last for long, but it's part of the reason I have started to speak more publicly about why I think it's important that we do pray explicitly and reference explicitly feminine forms for the divine, even though I think any transcendent divine is beyond human gender ideas. We humans are beyond our gender ideas. So certainly any divine is, but I think it's really important that we explicitly include the feminine in our ideas of the divine, especially because we have had, 3,000 to 5,000 years of explicitly male ones. So we have a little restorative justice for the feminine divine to work on. Yeah.
So how would you answer somebody who said, well, wait a minute, Jesus, he prayed to the Father, he didn't pray to the Mother. So how do you justify that? I could just hear somebody saying.
Yeah, I've got a few of those, myself. That's certainly the first thing that, in certain circles I hear back. And first of all, there's a lot of scholarship about this. I'm like nowhere near qualified to be able to talk about. This is one of the original sort of formative texts. I don't know if you can see it there. She Who Is, The Mystery of God in Feminist Theological Discourse by Elizabeth Johnson. This was, I think, 25 years ago, first published. So this is a fantastic resource. And another one that I really recommend is Womanist Midrash by Dr. Will Gaffney. And there's a lot of people doing really interesting things about this right now. But basically, my simple answer is that the idea that the divine was an intimate relationship, like a parent, was radical.
Yes.
And certainly I don't think that was meant to be an exclusive or even biological association like we've made it. So yeah,
it seems kind of funny that, that I mean, I think you're exactly right. That was very, even though that word father for God is not unknown in ancient Judaism, that was a radical departure from mainstream Judaism, just to name God as Father. But then Jesus goes a step further, and he cites it in Aramaic, Abba. That's an Aramaic. It's basically like saying daddy. Very similar. And so I could just people get all upset, like how can you refer to God as mother? Well, I mean, if Jesus is already calling God daddy, how uptight is he really about referring to God as mother or mama, like you're saying your child did?
Exactly. My little one's gone straight to Mama God. So, it's a connection of how she thinks of me, and she's reflecting that intimacy in her idea of whoever this, intimate divine that loves her is. So I think it's a beautiful concept. Yeah. And I don't think that's meant to be exclusive. Actually, a really interesting point that Reverend Gaffney makes multiple times in her work. She has a wonderful theo-ed talk called "The God Who Transcends Gender" that you can Google. It was basically a year ago that it was given, probably one of her last in-person talks. And she talks a lot. So she's a Hebrew scholar. And she says that one of the ways that the ancient translators got around the feminine and the divine, because God's spirit is a feminine noun, is they just always used a proper noun so that you would never have to have a pronoun. And so she basically says that there is this repressed feminine grammar that we should all be very familiar with. So I'm actually reading something from the book that is a quote from her. So she says, nothing else that we do for equity will work as long as a masculine God remains on the top of the pyramid. Like basically nothing else will matter. And she's about to have a womanist lectionary, the women's lectionary. She is a womanist scholar, but the women's lectionary come out in the Episcopal Church this fall, I believe. So she likes to say, anytime that God's spirit is there, you could imagine a she. So things like she rested on them, the spirit of God came upon David. You could say like, she came upon David, she made me. That phrase is used more than 30 times in Hebrew scriptures, usually describing God's spirit to urge somebody to take action. So imagine if we heard that 30 times even, just in the Hebrew scriptures, like she made me do that. So she says that actually she sometimes ironically calls herself a biblical literalist. She says feminine language for God occurs in the text repeatedly. This means that feminists and womanists advocating for inclusive and explicit feminine God language are not changing, but restoring the text, and could be considered biblical literalists, which she says with a little bit tongue in cheek, I think. I love realizing, thanks to scholarship like hers, that this isn't, I'm not necessarily one who thinks you have to have, proof texts for everything that you do. I believe in the sort of trajectory of, themes and liberation through scripture, but I do think for some people it's helpful to know that it's actually highly biblical to do this.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think so many people have been told for so many different more progressive causes, you have to step outside of Christianity to believe this or to do this. And it's like, no, you can find this all over the place in the heart and soul of Christianity. You don't have to step outside it to find these things. Yeah. Well,
right.
Now, I'm guessing probably from our audience, you're going to have less people who are asking about, well, why you can refer to God as mother if Jesus didn't. Although Jesus does stand over Jerusalem, say, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how I'd like to embrace you like a mother hen. So he does use actually feminine language himself. But I can hear more people asking, well, but why are we anthropomorphizing God to begin with? Aren't we creating God in our own image? How do you respond to that?
Well, we certainly we have no other way to communicate on the soul level but through symbol and metaphor. That's simply how we work. It's how we operate. I love, I just saw something on Twitter today that got a whole interesting response. Somebody was saying, God is non-binary, God's pronoun is they, which of course I think that's wonderful. I think that's great. Sounds
almost Trinitarian.
It does. Absolutely. I think we need to be cautious in our efforts to expand, beyond gender binaries, which I fully support. We have to make sure we don't skip over explicitly including the feminine, because it has been intentionally repressed for thousands of years, and we are still, as a society, very much reckoning with unhealthy patriarchy and the results of that, and women and girls are still subjugated in many places in the world, and that is empowered with this idea that God is male and therefore male has become God. And if we don't break that open with explicit feminine pronouns and imagery, I'm afraid we will simply be sort of skipping over the crucial aspect of making sure that it's very clear that women and girls are also created, are also part of the divine image. So I do think, going to gender neutral is a great step. I just think it's not the only step. And a lot of people who are uncomfortable with she for God are just wanting to skip that step altogether. And I think we're moving a little too quickly sometimes, because we're getting around that discomfort. And that still shows that we have a challenge with this idea of the feminine also being in the divine image. There's a great quote in Elizabeth Johnson's book about this. It's like, why, under the question about why should we use female symbols for God? And she says, basically, God as a neutral term isn't neutral. It doesn't land in our bodies as neutral, because we have thousands of years of liturgy, art, music. Everything has been so associated. The number one image is the Sistine Chapel, right? The flowing white beard reaching out to Adam. Like, that's our number one associated image in the Western world. Anytime somebody says God, that's where your mental space goes, even if you're trying not to. So it doesn't land as gender neutral for us. So she basically is saying, it has these patriarchal associations, whether we want it to or not. And she said, but most serious of all, it papers over the problem of the implied inadequacy of women's reality to represent God. So I think it's really crucial that it's a both and process, not a let's just skip this and go straight to like gender neutral, because we've got a ways to go before we can truly hear. Actually, there's quite a few people who spell God. Have you seen this before? They spell it differently to help remind them in visual form that they are not dealing with that white bearded man in the sky. Can you see this? They spell it Godde.
Oh, kind of an old English kind of thing, yeah. And of course, in the Jewish community, that very frequently you see a G with a dash D as well.
I'm not sure that's done for exactly the same reasons.
No.
No,
it has to do with their historical, not referring to, not pronouncing the name of God in English. That's kind of God's name now. So, yeah. I was telling people this morning that I in our worship that I was very, very committed to inclusive language for the first 20 years of my ministry, and just felt adamant about that. And so if I ever referred to God with a masculine pronoun, it was simply because somehow I stepped up into some time machine and was suddenly a teenager and said it, it kind of made a mistake. But after 20 years, I would notice a couple things that, both congregations, I was in 2 prior congregations for 13 years and I was using inclusive language to all of them. But I found even people who were deep in, who knew the theology of, it would resonate with my own theology and the church's theology and so forth. Even leaders, if they stood to give a public prayer, they would often say, and God our Father, or He, and use he. And I thought, after this many years, you're still doing that? Like, this is weird. And I realized, well, yeah, it's kind of like that masculine language is going like, it's a huge rushing torrent, and by just being neutral, neutering the language, you're in the torrent. You say, "Oh, I'm not going to help that torrent out," but the torrent is still flowing downstream. Like you got to get into the stream and then start marching up the stream, change the stream a little bit, use to bring a little bit more balance, back to things, or like you're saying. So why is this important? I hear you saying it's important because we are. There are about 50% or just slightly more than 50% of the world's population that is really feeling like they are not, they're kind of excluded from the divine realm. But is there anything, does it change your understanding of the divine herself?
For me, it does. And I've had an experience with quite a few people as we've sort of entered in this practice together. I was actually in a women's small group a couple years ago when we sort of started, we actually read Sue Monk Kidd's book, Dance of the Dissident Daughter, together. Which I think half of the women ended up in marriage counseling after we read that book. It broke open a lot of stuff. I mean, it was women where a couple of them hadn't even heard the term patriarchy before. So it was some revolutionary concepts there. But I remember one woman in particular said she had started imagining when she prayed that God was like a mothering figure. And she said she no longer had fear about God. Like she suddenly felt this just compassionate embrace. And actually we started listening to it was a group, it was a sort of a, many evangelicals in that particular group, and they'd grown up listening to Amy Grant music. And we started listening at one point to El Shaddai, which can be interpreted as the many-breasted one. And there's actually many references throughout all of the scriptures to God as this nursing, sustaining, nourishing source, which makes complete sense. We're talking about these scriptures were written in the Iron Age, when the only source of nourishment for a baby would have been breast milk. Like there weren't, there wasn't formula and other things like this. Like this was how humans survived. Right. So I think it's completely logical that we would have so many metaphors of nursing a baby for the divine. And when you think of, and it was really empowering to me when I was nursing my own babies to think of sustaining them, in this very tangible way, and to like imagine that metaphor being, a divine for us and her, sustaining milk of our lives. Like it's a beautiful metaphor. And I just felt softer in my relationship with the divine. I didn't feel as worried or harsh. It was easier to just imagine a divine mother. And one of the challenges is we don't have a ton of imagery at all. I wrote a little thing and I put in some art, and it can be hard to find. These are a few of the works of art that I found.
So for those of you who might be listening in an audio version, you're seeing a number of people of color who are depicted as saints in different forms.
Yeah, saints. I really love this one. This is like a cosmic mother with a vase. This is very much like there's a Kabbalah, excuse me, it's bedtime where I am, from the Jewish Kabbalah. There's a story very similar to this. My own daughter has been painting. She did this when she was 8.
That's a beautiful divine feminine
Mother God.
Beautiful.
Yeah, she's holding the universe, and her robe turns into rain, and she's rainbow colored. She's supposed to. That was meant to represent all people, and she just did this one a few weeks ago. This is Mother God, and she has now started painting her as black, which I love.
Wow.
Riding a phoenix.
I've got the feeling if there's a new Sistine Chapel, I know who's going to be painting the ceiling.
Yeah, we need so much more artwork. It's actually going to be one of my next projects, I think, is to do some children's books that include some glorious art from a variety of different artists, because we need help imagining something that, we just haven't. We've had thousands of years giving us other images that are strongly masculine, and we definitely need some other, mental containers for our soul to imagine what this might be like. But
that's awesome.
I know it doesn't work for everybody. There are some people who have had very strained relationships with maternal figures in their lives.
Sure.
But certainly for me, it allowed me to have a much softer idea of, that it was just the judgment somehow left quickly. And I was able to feel more unconditional love in that.
That's great. Yeah. It was very, very rich. Thank you so much. Incidentally, the church, Countryside Community Church on the Tri-Faith Commons in Omaha, Nebraska, this is in the middle of the country, when they built their new church, they named each of the rooms after biblical women, and they're all about biblical women. So they have like 13 rooms, and so you have to learn the biblical women to know where you're going in the building.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight. This has been a very rich conversation, and I hope maybe some people kind of may see things a little differently about divine. If there's been any bit of concern about that, either from the Jesus didn't refer to God as mother, or from anthropomorphizing too. But look forward to circling back around to you sometime.
Thanks so much, Eric.
Yeah, thank you. And just a reminder to our listeners that next week we will be featuring Ian Durius, the stand-up comedian from Portland, talking about non-dualism. So there's another kind of following on this theme of, here we did have kind of a binary. There's male and female, and we're going to now go beyond binary with Ian. So join us next week for the Converging Paths videocast. Have a good evening.